You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm pleased to be joined today by Clayton Reid of MMGY Global, which is actually a roll-up of a bunch of things, but that's actually the first question I've got, is to sort of hear that roll-up story. And I guess the private equity firm probably powered that. What's the origin story for that?
Yeah, Kevin, we don't like to say roll-up, but
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, MMG, the heritage of the company is a company called MMG Worldwide and a company called Y Partnership. That mashed up to MMGY Global. And when we sold to private equity, one of the things we wanted to do was grow our travel footprint through acquisition. So it's absolutely true. We've bought everything from a data company to several PR boutiques to full service agencies to representation firms. And we've done that to try to grow our influence globally in travel. So 3 of our acquisitions have been in Europe, several in the United States. But for us, it's all about travel. Our mantra as a company is we inspire people to go places. So every acquisition we're doing is in the travel industry and against an integrated stack of marketing services.
Great. And when you're pitching, do they pitch independently or do they pitch as a unified group?
The orientation of our company, MMGY Global, is the parent company, and every operating brand has MMGY in front of it. So, for example, our New York boutique for PR, which is now 50 people, is MMGY NJF. And we bought Nancy Friedman's company, NJF, a number of years ago. So it's all mashed up with MMGY, and it's all integrated and wholly owned. So we really do try to connect it all together. And very often clients want us to integrate our services. So it is connecting multiple operating brands to one assignment in the cruise space and tourism especially.
Great. Well, getting into what you and your teams do every day, the travel marketing. Obviously, travel marketing has changed a lot in the last 2 years in particular. There was probably a hiatus, which may or may not have stopped for every one of the companies, but many of them are really back to marketing pretty heavily. But I'm guessing their marketing mix and the marketing messaging looks a lot different than it did pre-pandemic. So I'd love to hear sort of how you're advising clients to deal with the ever-evolving new normal.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and absolutely true. The landscape shifted so quickly. I think, during the height of the pandemic in 2020, most brands retreated from almost all marketing. Travel came to a standstill. So there was still an emphasis on PR and crisis communication. So some of our PR teams remained pretty busy, and social. So especially leaning into a narrative around how your brand was addressing COVID and how you were or were not open, what travel opportunities there were. I think during, a lot of brands thrived in COVID, brands that were home-based, telemedicine, telefitness, et cetera. But obviously travel as an experiential industry shut down. So coming out of that, and this is a lot of what you know too, is that the understanding of customer data and really understanding when people were going to come back to travel, how they were going to come back to travel was crucial. And I give our team a lot of credit. Our research team's called MMGY Travel Intelligence, and they predicted the leisure travel recovery in 2020 before a lot of people were predicting it. And I think that team really nailed it in terms of what demand conditions were in place full on by late spring this year. And so now what's happening, because there was so much leisure demand and because there was some rate compression being created, labor's short, so it's not everybody's open to full capacity. There's still some restrictions around travel. The marketing became much more curated. And in that, there were pockets of travelers who were more likely to travel in this environment. They were more likely to go to certain places. And parsing that data and advising our clients on how to engage that was really important. So you can imagine how we consulted with our cruise line clients was very different than how we consulted with a tourism client who's heavily rural or resort oriented or mountain or beach oriented. And parsing the data and understanding traveler sets and where those demand generators are going to come from was really, really important to how we led our clients.
Have the teams had to become more nimble? It seems like a lot of, you mentioned sort of crisis management from a PR perspective and certainly from a social perspective. That's an extension sort of the earned media ecosystem. So have they had to sort of be on and sort of nimble much more so than pre-pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think mostly around in-trip messaging or pre-trip messaging, because there was no mistaking that certain pockets of travelers wanted to travel and good brands were getting out in front of that, both from a brand positioning standpoint and a retail, bookings, e-commerce standpoint. But once people booked, and remember in travel recovery, some of those bookings were happening very long out because airlines predominantly removed their cancellation and change fees. People were booking on longer tails than they normally would. So it was important for brands to get out early and not necessarily be flexible to that, but be talking to their customers. But as people got closer to their trips, being really nimble around communicating what was open, what wasn't, what security protocols were in place, what touchless protocols were in place, how borders were being dealt with. I mean, that became really important close into trip experience. And that's where I think our teams had to be a lot more nimble around messaging. And that primarily happened through eDirect and eCRM, through paid social and other kinds of organic social content. And that's by nature, those things are a little bit more nimble, but became a crucial part of the marketing mix and still are today. But especially as the summer season started, when people were still a little unsure about what the trip experience might be.
Did the high-end leisure market recover first, or was it sort of even across the different price points?
Yeah. Well, let's start with this. Travel in the United States, anyway, is primarily the province of household incomes of $50,000 or more. We don't even really track a lot of travel behavior for households under that income threshold because most of travel's middle class or up anyway. And when you look at the wealth that was gathered during the pandemic for middle class and up families, there was really not a resource issue in terms of being able to afford travel in every socio-demographic set. That's very different than how it was in 08, 09. Coming out of that recession, economic wherewithal was a huge part of the headwind in travel recovery. It just was not in this case. So to answer your question, certainly the more affluent travelers were more prepared economically to travel, but I would not argue that that was a big difference between even middle-class families. Everybody wanted to travel. Everybody had saved money. Everybody was in a work-from-home environment, or not everybody, but many, where they had the flexibility to sort of build travel around where they wanted to go. So what is true about travel in the summer in the United States and really even internationally is that prices are way up. So when you talk about broad inflation in the US economy, the travel industry is one of the fastest and highest inflation rates of any industry in the United States. That's a combination of the fact that there was reduced capacity. There were certain places that people wanted to go more than others. And most travel suppliers couldn't generate revenue from demand and volume alone. They had to plus up their rates and fares. So consequently, the travel for domestic US travel or leisure travelers became very expensive. And if you look at what people were willing to pay in terms of premium, it was a significant increase over 19 and really a significant increase over coming out of 9-10. So in 10-11. So that's a very real condition that's still in place today. There's pretty strong pricing in place for airlines, cruise lines, hotel companies, and rental car companies.
Interesting. Have they, obviously you mentioned earlier, the sort of cancellation policies have become a lot less restrictive, a lot more fluid for airlines and perhaps to some extent for lodging as well. How does that end up netting out from a communications perspective? I mean, is that a strong element of the communications plan because people want to feel confident that, if the situation changes, they're not hanging out on a limb for their booking fees?
It's a great question. There's actually a bifurcation in what we call the booking window in travel. There's this long-tailed booking that I talked about earlier, and then there's the short booking window that's still prevalent in some cases because people are canceling. For example, in the midst of Delta, there's a 2% cancellation rate right now, which is much lower than people think, but there's about a 2% cancellation rate. And those people who are canceling are very likely to come back to travel on a very short notice once they feel safe again. So you have this bifurcation, people who are booking well in advance and then people who are booking the last minute. So from a marketing standpoint, brands have to be able to seed markets with long-term brand communication, especially relative to international travel. You've got international brands who have to be seeding their routes today. And then you have brands and most travel suppliers who have to be prepared on a moment's notice to drive some new demand generators because they get some cancellations. The cruise industry is actually a perfect example of that. The sale, no sale orders have been in and out. The ability to cruise at all has been in and out. So cruise lines who rely very heavily on long-term advance bookings, they try to fill their ships well over a year in advance of cruise, have had to think about strategies that allow them to fill berths more quickly because of cancellation rates. So the cruise lines have done two things. One, they've said, if you cancel, we'll give you a credit towards a forward-looking booking. So book a different cruise in the future, we'll give you credit for that. No cancellation penalty, et cetera. Some cases, even a cancellation bonus. Some people are given incentives to roll that booking forward. But then these cruises that are going forward, especially the shorter sailings, those cruise lines are sometimes needing to fill that inventory at a last minute. So they're putting deals in place or trying to be real aggressive in filling those ships before they sail. And that's sort of a perfect poster child for what's going on in travel broadly right now. And by the way, to your point earlier, and my point too, about cancellation policies, the airlines are slowly starting to roll those back. Mm-hmm. So as they saw the industry getting healthier, they began to announce, the major carriers, I think, have all announced that they'll be putting back in place some restrictions around cancellation and rebooking. And they make billions of dollars a year on those fees. So it's a revenue generator that they're not going to necessarily forego long-term. And as they saw demand start to pick up, they started to announce that they're going to put those policies back in place.
So a lot of what you were mentioning are sort of the more traditional vacations. Now, is the staycation here to stay, or is the staycation really more of a blip?
Yeah, I don't think it's funny because to me, it's a great question. Staycations were always sort of a misnomer. Everybody's always done vacations close to home and in their community. I mean, the preponderance of leisure travel in our country in the United States is leisure weekend stays. Like that's by definition a staycation. There's been more of it during COVID for sure. Travel recovery was a recovery of the automobile. It was a recovery of the road trip. Initially only a couple hundred miles from home. That stretched out to 400 or 500 miles from home. But what we think is more interesting is what we coined work from vacation. So this notion that, and this is one of the reasons you saw Airbnb and other shared accommodations really grow quickly in COVID, because people were literally able to work from anywhere they wanted to, and they were selecting vacation spots to work from with their families. And we called that work from vacation. And I think those conditions are actually going to remain in place for a while, primarily because you see employers continuing to be flex with their office schedules. So great example, some of the biggest companies are going to Monday, Friday flex, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in office. Well, think about in the travel industry what a Monday, Friday flex means for travel behavior. And so traditionally the travel industry revenue manages on weekends, leisure, all week corporate. So it's a Sunday to Thursday, Friday, Saturday mentality in terms of revenue management. Now with that Friday, Monday bookend, travel suppliers have to make decisions about, are they going to cater more to a 3-4 day leisure model versus a 2-day leisure model? And we do think those conditions are in place for a while. We think the flexible work environments, and even in some cases, flexible school environments, though that's fewer than has been in the past, you're going to see families and or travelers work from places in which they do not reside.
Yeah, well, it'll be fascinating to watch that because the industry, that's one area where the some portions of the industry are fairly nimble, right, and have been able to adapt. So think about it from the strategic level. I think as this is perhaps more so now as budgets are looked at as more fluid than they had in the past. One of the first decisions that a big travel marketer, or medium-sized for that matter, needs to make is sort of earned media versus paid media. And then there's a sort of overlap for social where it's like, okay, which bucket is this really in? It starts out as an earned media thing and then I boost it. But, from the perspective of thinking that through, right, if X is the travel budget, is the travel marketing budget for a major brand, and they sort of have to think about, okay, demand gen, in the short window is pretty much all paid like that I know where my levers are, right? And then, but a lot of the earned media really probably helps get the bookings that are going to be further out, right? And so how do they think that through? And should they be pretty nimble in moving budgets from paid media to earned media and back?
Yeah, it's such a good point. We believe in our shop that paid media in the social environment has tipped over. Like you could still make some inroads with organic social content or engaging influencers organically, but most of that's now tipped over to a paid model. If you really want to exercise an influencer on your brand or on retail bookings, you're paying that influencer, you're engaging them in ways that aren't really earned media. And I think for us, the way we have a pretty large public relations operation, but we connect that with our creative and social operations. A lot of that's paid content development, paid influencer development, et cetera. And I think that's going to become more and more pronounced. And even you talk a lot about, programmatic, in some ways, social's really become a programmatic platform.
Yeah, absolutely.
From an earned media standpoint, you're right. I think editorial forms brand perception. So it's still really important to create earned media environments where editorial can be written about your brand. But increasingly, that has to be very intentional. You have to have ideas that are unique and different to get the attention of writers who are now stretched very thin in terms of editorial content. So it's curating the long term through editorial, and then to your point, plussing it up with these paid influencer models or other kinds of paid engagement. And that's what's changed a lot just in the last few years. I think it's much harder to cut through with just standard PR work or standard organic social work. You really have to combine the two, and then have the creative resources to build narratives that are unique and to create those narratives in a unique way, executionally, which is a big part of what we do. But I think it's changed. It's definitely changed the landscape.
Yeah, one thing that we've sort of changed, because we started in SEO in 1996. So, and I was doing SEO before I even did it. So, we've really come to think about, digital PR and PR as helping control the entire SERP, right? As opposed to SEO that's just about getting the domain itself to rank for great content. And it seems like you've got all the pieces in place to really try to, create ubiquity of positive mentions of the brand through PR, through digital PR, potentially through influencer marketing. Do you consider that an extension of your SEO plan, or are they really still fairly siloed?
No, I think you're exactly right. Or any kind of organic work, SEO work has to be tied to the bigger ideas about how you want to engage customers. And, you were a pioneer in this space. We did some early on, but it was much more about tagging content in the right way, creating the right architectures on the website. That's just not the case anymore. I mean, those things are still important, but to your point, being intentional about the type of content and tying that through to what your paid investments are, to us, is the only way to make it work. I mean, tying paid search very specifically to content areas, be they on social platforms or your own e-commerce and website platforms, those things have to be very closely tied together. And what amuses me about a lot of, at least in the travel industry, a lot of paid search organizations, is they use these automated platforms and focus on returns around branded search, right, versus really focusing on unbranded search and the ways in which you're creating incrementality. And I think you're right. In this day and age, you have to be there or you're wasting money. And I think in the travel industry in particular, because people, when they talk about travel, even commercial travel, a lot of it's inspirational. People, even when they're going to a meeting in Las Vegas, it's an inspirational trip. It's not just a transaction. So building good storytelling around organic and search content is what connects the inspiration to the transaction. And those things have to be connected in any good marketing program.
Indeed, they do. So here's a question I just thought of, but we thought we were sort of past the pandemic, but now maybe we're not so much. And your creative teams, are they having discussions when they're doing the photo shoots or using imagery, whether or not to have the people masked or unmasked? Is that a conversation?
No, absolutely. That's an issue we've tackled with many of our clients. And by and large, the answer has been no, we're not going to show people in masks. People know the situation. Right. There's no reason to remind them of that. I think early in the pandemic, there were reasons to communicate, especially in social, some of those protocols, but no, we just did a major photo shoot in Mexico. We're doing one on a cruise line, international cruise line expedition right now. We have no intent to use masks in those photo shoots. I do think that you have to communicate today in your branding and messaging clean and healthy. And I think those things can be communicated more subtly than literally showing someone with a mask or literally showing someone cleaning, a surface.
Right.
There are ways to communicate through touchless service and other things that can be shown in photo shoots, video, other types of content, ways to communicate that safety message without doing it masked. And we by and large, are not in favor of showing masks in the work we're doing.
That does bring me to an interesting Ad Age Harris poll that I think came out maybe last week or earlier this week, where they said that 53% of all forms of shoppers, whether it was travel or otherwise, would prefer to engage with a brand that has a mask mandate, so that they can feel safer. So it's to your cleanliness and safety message, right? Certainly, a vaccine mandate is one way of communicating. Okay, in comparison to otherwise, you're in a safer environment.
Certainly, there are controlled travel and restaurant environments where vaccinations are mandated,
right?
And the cruise industry, in particular, where they've really tried to build those walls around any kind of infections, and I think that's prudent. The thing about that, and again, I'm fully vaccinated. I wear a mask when I'm indoors here in Kansas City. But that poll, it's not 47%, but a large number of people also said they don't necessarily see a need for masks. You've still got 40% plus in this country that are not vaccinated. And I think it's interesting. We think everybody should be vaccinated. We think travel will recover more quickly when everybody's vaccinated and we reach those thresholds that we all want to get to. But you also, if you look at the research, I will tell you that demand will be tamped down if airlines or tourism entities or cities require vaccination for entry. It is a headwind for demand. Right or wrong, I'm not making a judgment about it medically or socially. I'm just saying that certainly operators know that.
Right. Well, this was the operators and just their staff, right? That particular poll, not.
Well, and Disney, for example, has just come to an agreement with their union to vaccinate their employees. There are a lot of airlines, Delta, for example, who's requiring vaccinations. So it's a prudent thing to do. And I think it's easier to do for employees than it is to do for travelers, because it's harder to test and measure on a rapid basis travelers. And you have to know that you're going to cut off a fairly large swath of the market by requiring those things. And again, it could be the right thing to do socially, but if you talk about revenue generation, it would be a headwind based on our research.
So from a sort of look forward basis, are there any things going on either from a platform perspective or overall efficiency perspective or shiny objects that you're excited about testing for clients on a go forward basis?
Well, if 2009 and 2010 were a flashpoint for the online travel aggregators or the OTAs to grow their business as intermediaries in travel, the Expedias, the Bookings, et cetera, I think the opposite is happening in this crisis. I actually think suppliers are taking more control of their customers and their inventory. The OTAs are still incredibly influential in booking and still important, but I would argue less so. And when you ask about shiny objects, I think travel suppliers have started to get control of the narrative with their customers that if you want the best inventory, you want the best flexibility, you want the best experience, you will book directly. So that's changing things. Second, I think the use of data now, I mean, we're putting off the privacy controls for another couple of years in terms of cookies, but everybody's starting to get their house in order in terms of data and how to use data. And in the travel industry, we call what are called closed user groups or CUGs, this ability to connect with customer groups directly and expose deals to them that the other intermediaries in your business cannot provide. There's been some incremental movement in that space. And I think for that reason, travel suppliers are stronger now from an e-commerce standpoint than they were going into the pandemic. And I think that still has time to play out. I actually think over time, data technology and smart data is going to help precipitate that even further. The travel industry is incredibly segmented and fragmented in terms of distribution and bookings. And whoever is the best at harnessing data and these one-on-one relationships, I think wins. And that's likely to produce some new entrants into the travel space from a marketing standpoint.
Interesting. Do you think that the policy differences with regards to cancellation, with regards to masking, with regards, since everyone's communicating with their customer around a lot of the uncertainty, is that part of what's driving the desire to have the direct relationship?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. I think they're still third-party. Google's done a fantastic job adding into their search results some some information around, protocols and what's open and safety and all that. But I absolutely think so. If you're booking a 7-day resort vacation in Colorado, you're going to get very specific with that resort about what you can do, what the issues are. And to your point, you're opening up a relationship with that resort you may not have had to have going into the pandemic, pre-pandemic. So I think that is important. I also think that when you think about the way consumers are behaving today, they have started to take more control. People who weren't really tech savvy have had to force themselves into learning technology. And I specifically talk about older travelers. Still, one of the most bountiful segments in travel is travelers 60 years and older, who typically eschewed technology and would rely on traditional travel agents or traditional methods of booking. There's no doubt in our surveys that those travelers are becoming more tech savvy, which permits a different relationship with with their suppliers, with the travel providers. So I do think that's a condition that's changed as well.
Do you feel like, in some cases, at least in the past, the travel organizations, the lodging or in more than airlines would sort of do these pre-sale bulk sales to and end up having a channel conflict from a pricing perspective with some of the same folks that they sold the inventory ahead of, right? Now that a lot of them are sort of promising to match any rate, they're potentially like fighting with their own channel, right, on rate matches. Has that created a sort of confusion for the consumer, or is it really just an internal mess that the industry has to figure out?
The industry's always had that problem. 71% of travelers don't trust the pricing content they see online. It's because the marketplace, as I said earlier, is so fragmented. And you do have many, many different sources of rate information and travel information, which creates a natural and inherent distrust in travelers. Again, what's different about this? If I showed you, for example, the Southwest marketing in summer of 2020 versus this summer, you would see a lot more rate and discount offers in 20 than you're seeing today. Discounting and price leads have not been as much a part of the retail marketplace as they were in 20 because demand is so strong.
Right.
So you actually have a little bit less conflict on price than you traditionally have. But I think that's a long-term institutional problem the travel industry has, is with rate and fair visibility and transparency for customers. And that's why they inherently distrust what they see and typically use 35 to 40 different websites before they book a travel experience, because they're wanting to confirm and validate what they're seeing and trying to figure it out. So I think, and that's not COVID born, that's been the case for a long time.
Right. Well, I guess whether that gets sorted out is a bigger systemic issue for the industry.
Correct. And I think it comes back to data and what you do. I mean, it comes back to using data to understand and have relationships with customers where you can provide them relevant and timely offers that don't get a lot of scrutiny. Southwest Airlines, a lot of their customers do not shop them. They book on their channel because they have such strong brand equity around being the low-cost carrier, even though in many cases they are not the low-cost carrier.
Right.
But they have this amazing brand equity that commands of their customers a uniform loyalty. And I think a lot of travel suppliers would like to be in that same place, and they aren't. But if over time they use data to connect in that way, there's hope that they could at least move the needle a little bit.
Has there been any change in consumer behavior or perspective on sort of the whole points/miles conversation? Is that still this sort of sticky CRM glue that holds people to brands, or is it not as sticky as it used to be?
In the airline industry, I think it's every bit as sticky. Most airlines rolled status forward from COVID. So if you had loyalty status, you got it again, even though you didn't travel at all in the year. It's never been as powerful in the rental car or hotel industry. I think as the hotel companies continue to aggregate into these 4 big behemoths and have multiple brands, I saw Intercontinental Hotel Group launched, I think, their 27th brand this week. So as these hotel companies have all these brands, they do have an opportunity to leverage loyalty a little more importantly for better rates, for better inventory, for, when you were an economy brand but added a luxury brand into your portfolio, you now have the carrot to get people to invest in the loyalty program. So I think there'll be some movement there. But to your question, in the airline industry, loyalty is every bit as important and absolutely dictates behavior. Points programs really matter in the airline space.
Great. As a final question, so what other things that they're probably not thinking about should travel marketers be thinking about now for their next year's worth of planning, or maybe for their 2022 planning?
Yeah, even though cookie privacy controls have been put off, we still think the most important thing that travel suppliers need to be doing today is better understanding their data and putting privacy controls into place. And more than that, as marketing shifts from this model of frequency and incessant, annoying marketing programs at the retail level, moving back to the persuasion and permission models that were really marketing in its heyday of the 70s and 80s, where you had to create a relationship with a customer to get their business. And I think the only way to get past the cookie technology changes is to start to build these really solid relationships with customers that are predicated on personal data they're willing to give you, and you in turn giving them content and information that they really want. And I think we're still not anywhere close to that model in the travel industry, but I think the smart marketers will get there.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me. This has been a fascinating conversation on one of the industries that is been most impacted by the last whatever it is, 20 months, wherever we are right now. So I look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks for your time. Enjoyed it.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.